activity of the day. So some of you, if you have children between the ages of newborn and 5, and you don't mind partaking in your questionnaire, come bombard me for today. I would really appreciate it. It would help my dissertation. And it's the last part of my data collection, so it would be really quick. So if you do, perfect. Thank you. So we've got
Can we have the sound up a bit, Mike?
I am quite quiet up north, you know, small town and all that. We're like, so now I could stand closer, and then we'll have to. Have we got a clicker? Or, yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we. Oh, we've gone too far.
Too far.
I'm going to talk a bit about how if we disconnect. We can also utilise that to also reconnect. So I'm going to first talk a bit about Theybies, and then we can go from there. So if you press the button, thank you. Okay, so gender-created parenting uses the term Theybies, which describes children which the parents use they/them pronouns from birth instead of the traditional she, her, he, him. And they do not disclose the child's anatomy to the majority of people. Some choose to decide who they do and they don't. The parents will create a gender-free environment where possible, away from socialisation of the expected gender norms, in hopes that the children will make a choice when they are ready, with the idea of considering that gender is a spectrum, and that amongst that spectrum is cisgender, intersex, non-binary, transgender people, gender non-conforming people as well. So it's not the idea of raising children to be gender neutral, but without the restrictions and limitations from social constructions of gender, by removing those stereotypes which usually are assigned to a person when the sex of the baby is assigned at birth, which is usually male or female, which is based on the genitalia or the anatomy. Brilliant. So arguably then, to its detriment, to ignore the biological differences, you can deny a child the opportunity to build on their innate strengths. Robert argues that we should stop the sexual and politicalisation of the childhood, and children should see their anatomy as something to be celebrated and not shameful. And that this ideology is to satisfy an adult gender which seeks to disguise the reality of the cruelty that is subjected onto a human before they can even speak. Where we all are quick to label any behaviours where we actually should just wait for nature to take its course. However, there are advantages which are that parents could then identify universally desirable human traits and values which they would like to adopt and promote. And also gender stereotypes results in 53% of women and 69% of men arguing that it has a negative and damaging effect on their development, relationships and positioning within society, and gender-created parenting seeks to limit this. So it is important then to understand the power behind the words sex and gender when considering gender-created parenting. So here we go. So Judith Butler presented a juxtaposed position in arguing that we do not become our genders prior to a place, to culture or embedded life, but essentially within those terms. And these terms build on the discussion as to whether sex or gender are biologically given or socially constructed, despite continuous claims that argue their positioning. Torgrimsson and Minson contested that sex is biologically determined and gender is culturally determined, whereas Lucas Stannard would argue that in Western society there are two categories for gender, which is used synonymously with sex, and these are male and female, and they are based on the biological features of genitalia and sex organs, setting a position that sex and gender are biologically given. However, when this is biologically or socially undeniable, you're labelled as intersex or transgender or gender non-conforming, or you're labelled as those who transgress normativity. Sam Smithers from the Full Cut Society's chief executive argued that gender stereotypes have such a negative effect on people. We now live in a society where boys cannot express their emotions, become aggressive, underachieve at school, and go on to be part of a culture of toxic masculinity which normalises violence. And she doesn't stop there. She goes on to speak about how girls have a low self-esteem and body issues, and with 1 in 5 14-year-old girls leading to self-harming. So that leads me on to labelling. So then if we think about labels then can have an incredibly useful discussion about privilege and power. And that sometimes when we label ourselves, we do it to describe, to find a community where we feel less weird, alone and unaccepted, but to feel empowered and to feel valued. So sometimes our labels are chosen for ourselves. But then consider then when we choose a label or are given a label, some of us will find that the attainment of resources, space and free expression are fundamentally then divided by institutions in association with a person's identification as belonging to a particular sex or gender group. And then, thank you. So then a label could then become deviant when it is used to designate the violation of social norms or normal, which are then internalized and become social stereotypes backed by religion, medicine and law. This paradoxically creates an us and them divide where someone is perceived as other, which is then used as a way of generating for humanity to be divided into two groups. A group, Stazak argues, a group that embodies the norms and whose identity is valued, and another that is defined by its faults, devalued and susceptible to discrimination. So if we think then that labels can be a tool used for oppression, it can be a tool for use for resistance as well. So it all depends on how we use them and when. So terms like transgender, gender non-conforming, non-binary, Theybies all can be considered as labels. Off we go. So consider then, Yellen argues, however, that those who transgress gender norms are seen as a threat, and for gender to maintain its authoritative status of truth, it must be important that breaches are rectified as to not be exposed for its illusion. And so these breaches, we can see, are maintained through hate crimes or crimes of hate, which have resulted now in incidents from 2016, which were 1,073, have grew to be in 2019 to 1,944 cases of incidents. So we can see here now this is a situation where power and conflict arises from disagreement, and the reversal then of power to a protective of label is needed, which leads to. So if we think about Yuri Bromford-Brenner, who proposed the illogical systems theory, which explains that human development can be influenced by different types of environments. And our development would occur over time with interactions between ourselves and our environmental context, which we become a part of. And these interactions can influence our identity. It is our right to have identity, including that of a child claimed by the United Nations. Article 8.1 states that all parties should undertake and respect the preservation of a child and his or her identity, which I wrote a little note here to expand a bit more on the fact that it just says his or her identity. Funny that. So there's a little bit more, there's a bit of ambiguity here in the fact that it just literally only allows him or her. Anyway, the Declaration of Human Rights states that we all are equal before law, and we are entitled without any discrimination and equal protection by the law. Despite then the fact that we have the Equality Act, which then labels people further who they are considering needs even more protection and need to be defined individually, which then contributes to the labelling theory. So there are rights, there are laws, there are acts, but then there also are hate crimes, murders and abuse, leading to toxic masculinity culture for men and self-harming and body-hating culture for women. So something needs to be done beyond the law, which leads to my amazing diagram. So all this in turn then, in simplistic form, all this in turn then produces ideologies such as gender-created parenting and Theybies, as the need for a minority segregation is to highlight the inequalities in society for progressive change, while to focus on those socially excluded is to focus on new ways of inclusion. Thomas Zook explains that gender conformity is ambiguously assumed and therefore becomes meaningful only in relation to unexpected expressions of gender identity. The term cisgender is used to refine the concept as a social construction that becomes meaningful only when juxtaposed to its opposite, transgender. This is the last one. So cisgender, you can see, is only relevant if it's juxtaposed with its opposite of transgender. So if you look at this now, binary, non-binary, gender-forming, gender-non-conforming, babies, Davies, so you see how they're all the opposite, okay? Intersex in the middle, I'm going to go to one second. So Davies then is a positioning of our times, considering Jennifer Chiazang's sex and gender, or explanation of sex and gender as a continuum of complex social, psychosocial self-perceptions, attitudes and expectations. And these labels are ambiguous at best. Butler would argue then, within a culture that so readily punishes and marginalises those who fail to perform the illusion of gender essentialism should be a sign enough that on some level there is social knowledge that the truth and falsity of gender is only socially compelled and in no sense ontologically necessitated. Consider them to build upon harmony, that the disconnectivity from the norms, be it through Theybiesism, transgenderism, or gender non-conforming, builds on the connectivity of normal through the ever-evolving, that's my circle there, forms of positionality in juxtapositions with labels such as babies, cisgender, especially considering those who are intersex in the middle there, where undefined terms of biological and social definitions of sex and gender exist paradoxically to create new labels. I'm hoping that most people, if people don't understand what the term intersex means, I can explain that a little bit more. Yeah, okay. So consider them, in the words of Jonathan Ricks, that a label is a generalised term which creates a specific identity. It defines an aspect of something to focus upon, not the whole of what that thing is. So an apple may seem fine for an everyday term for the most of us, but is a vague description for an apple farmer. Thank you. If no one has any questions,
One of the